Hello. In describing cinematic surrealism, I've emphasized that it aims to disrupt conventional approaches to reality by positing questions rather than posing answers. In Exterminating Angel, for example, we saw that Buñuel probes the psychology of collective thinking, the limits of individual freedom, and the Freudian death wish in ways that are open ended and unresolved. Well, Hiroshi Teshimagara's Woman in the Dunes is no less disarming a surrealistic masterwork than Buñuel's film, and the two share certain features. Like Exterminating Angel, this film that we're about to consider is a complex, ambiguous allegory of entrapment, in this case, not in an urban mansion, but in a deep sandpit in a remote corner of Japan. Both films feature claustrophobic confinement, either to a single room or a single house from which exit is impossible. In these confined spaces, Teshigahara, like Buñuel, peels away layers of civilized habits to explore the anarchic urges beneath them, and both films present versions of a survival story. That said, we'll see that Teshigahara poses different questions than Buñuel does. Different themes shape his work, and a different approach to surrealism informs his mise-en-scène and camera movements. Now, this isn't surprising, because Teshigahara, after all, comes from an Asian rather than a European culture. Michael Richardson, in his book on surrealistic film, notes that Teshigahara is the Japanese director who uses a surrealistic style most explicitly, but his approach derives from different sources than Buñuel's. Whereas Buñuel's interest in surrealism developed in Paris through his work with Salvador Dali and André Breton, Teshigahara's fascination arose largely from the 1955 novel Woman in the Dunes by the Japanese writer Kobo Abe. They became friends, worked together on films, and Teshigahara filmed Abe's novel, Woman in the Dunes, in 1964. Abe's narrative owes much to the novelist's fascination with Franz Kafka, but it also derives from Abe's strange experiences when he toured Chinese Manchuria after the Communist Revolution. He visited a swamp where the heads of executed political prisoners were being feasted upon by crows, and this memory fueled the fever dreams and surrealistic atmosphere of his fiction that he wrote afterward. Teshigahara captures these surrealistic elements in his film. Now, we don't find all four of the general traits of cinematic surrealism that I mentioned in my introduction to Exterminating Angel in Women in the Dunes, but we certainly do find some of them. We find, for example, an incongruous juxtaposition of the realistic and the mundane with the bizarre and the fantastic. We find a woman whose name is never learned cooking and keeping house as if she were living in some familiar domestic space, but she is surrounded by walls of collapsing sand, and her survival depends upon its removal. Also, like Exterminating Angel, Teshigahara's film unfolds like a paralyzing dream of repetition from which the protagonist, Junpei, cannot awaken. Teshigahara also gives us the visual and visceral shocks that we usually find in cinematic surrealism. Graphic, sometimes brutal sexuality, as well as strange tribal rituals of the village community that keep visiting the protagonist and keep him the woman's prisoner. However, unlike Exterminating Angel, Teshigahara's surrealism doesn't involve a fracturing of narrative time or a disruption of cause and effect. We understand how and why the protagonist has been captured like one of the insects that he stalks. We may find the purpose of this capture monstrous and frightening, but we realize the community has imprisoned him for the sake of the widow who needs a male. And we also learn that Junpei, the protagonist, is not the only visitor from Tokyo who has been captured and held in one of the village sand pits. Also, Teshigahara's film doesn't feature the self-reflexivity that informs the surrealism of Exterminating Angel and many other European surrealistic films. Whenever, for example, Buñuel cuts from the dark interior of the Nobile house to the sunny street outside, it's, for us, a temporary reprieve from Pluto's cave that reminds us that a filmmaker has been generating the weird dreamscape inside. But there's no invocation of such filmic self-awareness for the audience in Woman in the Dunes. But Teshigahara's style does reflect a unique sense of artifice that derives from the director's background in two visual arts that are highly revered in Japan: pottery design, and even more important, flower arrangement. Teshigahara's father was the famous headmaster of the Sogetsu Flower Arrangement School until his death in 1979. And at that point, Teshigahara gave up filmmaking and took over the headmaster position himself. This sense of arrangement, aesthetic arrangement, informs the carefully structured mise en scène in Teshigahara's landscape shots and the interior of the house, and his shots of unclothed bodies that we see in dramatic combinations of light and shadow. But the aim of these artful compositions is not aesthetic beauty per se, as one would find, say, in pottery or floral arrangement. No, Teshigahara, even though he used those methods, insisted that in his film, quote, the body and the landscape must not be considered something merely aesthetic, but rather as sites of reality. It's a question of superficial beauty behind which is hidden the reality I want to pursue as deeply as possible. Well, like Buñuel, Teshigahara operates from the premise that what is most real, what is most authentic in human nature, is submerged and can be revealed for study only when the concealing habits of our ordinary life are shattered through some strange dislocation. In Woman in the Dunes, this peeling away of surfaces reflects the central theme we find in all of Teshigahara's films, the exploration of personal identity. Now, identity is a layered concept in Japanese cultural tradition. It refers both to a feeling of selfhood rooted in personal relationships, but it also refers to one's sense of membership in a particular social or tribal group, as opposed, say, to a larger nation or to society in general. Now, in Women in the Dunes, the local villagers define themselves primarily through their small enclave and its ancient traditions. It's primarily identity as belonging. Well, at the start, Junpei lacks a sense of identity in both the individual and affiliative respects. He says he's a teacher in the city at the beginning, but not in any self-descriptive way. Instead, he tells the woman that he is, quote, only good for catching insects by the tail. This implies that Junpei is seeking a more satisfying self-definition as an amateur entomologist. He wants to get his name in a field guide by finding a variant of the tiger beetle in this region in order to authenticate the self that he wants to be. Now, in the absence of such a mark of distinction, Junpei lacks a clear idea of himself as an individual, nor, at the beginning, is Junpei part of a tribal group or family from when he's in the city. What one critic aptly calls Junpei's identity adventure begins when he misses the last bus back to Tokyo and has to spend the night with the local widow assigned to her house by the villagers. Now, after the villagers collect him in the sand pit by pulling up the retractable rope ladder, Junpei's identity will evolve during his captivity. He'll be called teacher, helper, husband, and eventually he'll find a self-defining purpose and a group identity in the landscape of endless sand, individually in relation to the woman and collectively in relation to the village. Well, by peeling away civilized habits, his imprisonment ultimately establishes Junpei's identity as the woman's partner within the tribe. And as we'll see, he eventually shares with the tribe his scientific knowledge about water collection, sharing it with these very villagers who have enslaved him. Now, these forms of selfhood that I've just described that he will come to have nothing to do with his profession in Tokyo or what he calls, quote, the paperwork of officialdom. That is, those certificates that city dwellers artificially rely upon to identify who they are. For all of the perversity of Junpei's situation, it curiously provides for him a more authentic domestic and social identity conferred by the villagers who have very trapped him in the sand. Now, speaking of this ever-present and multi-layered symbol, sand, Teshigahara said of it, quote, in Woman in the Dunes, the sand represents for me the society in which we live. It blocks and interferes with human activity. We pause at that. What? Well, curiously, the society he's referring to as symbolized by the sand is not the remote village society that is built in the sand, but rather he's referring to the harmful effects of urban centers in post-World War II Japan as somehow fundamentally expressed by this sand symbol. We're reminded of it when Jumpi says at one point, quote, "This sand could swallow up cities." Well, in a sense, for Teshigahara, in a sense it has. The world that the protagonist escaped by coming to collect beetles is like the sand, arid. But he finds himself confined, once he is there, in the middle of nowhere, in a very different way. But at least the tribal village that holds him has a kind of communal codependency among its members that is absolutely missing in the anonymous and atomized city. The woman constantly sweeps sand not just to save herself, but also as a, quote, obligation on her part to protect the entire village. They all have to do it. They support her, the village does, in return, by giving her a man to help her. Now, the woman's task in this, of course, is to persuade Jumpi to accept his captivity and the local customs. And to do this, she must find unconventional ways to communicate with her captive at a time when Teshigahara believed interpersonal communication in post-war Japan was failing, due in part to the ingrained habits, the numbing habits of modern urban life. Well, as in Exterminating Angel, formulaic and devitalizing habits then block genuine communication. But for Teshigahara, they also inhibit personal and group identity. Thus, those habits, here as in Buñuel, must be stripped away. Now, note that Teshigahara distinguished these modern habits acquired in the city from the ancient and still living traditions of the villagers. But as we'll see, this is ambiguous as well, because the villagers' dark, primitive elements in certain rituals raise troubling questions about those traditions. Now, Teshigahara's reputation in the West rests almost entirely on the masterpiece that we're studying, but his surrealistic style emerged in his very first film, called Pitfall, which also features a strange subterranean landscape. In that case, one haunted by ghosts of dead mine workers in mines underground. His thematic preoccupation with identity also runs throughout his work, especially in a film titled The Face of Another, based on another Abe novel. Here, a man's face is severely burned in an industrial accident. A doctor fashions a mask for him that is almost indistinguishable from the man's old face, but he cautions that the new face might change the man's personality in dangerous ways. It does, and the protagonist becomes an entirely new person. We also see this desire to escape one's present life, as we saw in Face of Another, in Woman in the Dunes. And it points to a second major theme in Teshigahara's work, and that is vanishing. Now, this isn't just an abstract concept, but it was in fact an actual phenomena in post-industrial Japan in the mid-1960s. People simply went missing from Japanese cities, seemingly without any provocation or foul play, never to be seen again. This impulse to flight derives, in Teshigahara's view, from the alienating nature of urban life that oppresses Jumpi. And vanishing then, for some, amounts to a kind of existential rebellion against impersonal codes that erase any functional sense of self and prohibit communication. Now, it is a measure of how depersonalized the city life that Jumpi knows is, that he realizes he will be forgotten if he misses work for more than 3 days. He is merely an anonymous figure, merely a kind of replaceable functionary. Another Teshigahara film made in collaboration with Abe, The Man Without a Map, concerns a detective who searches for a missing man and finds himself wandering through dark labyrinths of crime and corruption. Again, the man he's pursuing has vanished. And vanishing also informs Summer Soldiers, about American GIs who are trying to vanish, trying to escape the Vietnam War by disappearing into Japanese society. Now, beyond the question of identity and vanishing, two other themes mark Teshigahara's work, particularly Woman in the Dunes, as we'll see. They're really two different forms of struggle. First, the struggle of man against nature, and second, the sexual or gender conflict between men and women. Jumpi, who studies how insects adapt themselves to a harsh climate, learns that he too must adapt to survive in nature, in an environment where collapsing sands threatens to swallow the house every day. Thus, Teshigahara's reminder that the sand dunes are not cinematographic postcards, but rather represent, among other things, an unforgiving place of natural strife and frequent death. Within the house, the struggle between the captive male and the woman, this gender struggle is complicated by Junpei's sense of masculine entitlement and by the woman's culturally derived desire to serve and accommodate him, even as she holds him prisoner. Ironically, the woman continues to call Junpei honored guest, yet she reveals aspects of herself that are curiously amoral, predatory, and even criminal, such as selling defective sand for city buildings which afterward collapse. Now, Junpei, despite his lack of self-esteem and self-definition in the city, nonetheless exhibits a need to dominate women and to assert himself on occasion when he finds himself trapped. Indeed, on one occasion, he will even do it through violent sexual aggression. Well, before beginning an analysis of Women of the Dunes, a few words about the film tradition in Japan to which Teshigahara belongs, or one might say out of which he and this film emerge. Starting in the 1960s, he was part of what came to be called the Japanese New Wave, a second generation of Japanese filmmakers, of which Teshigahara, I think, is easily the most distinctive and certainly the most avant-garde. Now, like all filmmakers of that generation, Teshigahara was working in the wake of three older, established, world-class film directors, Yasuhiro Ozu, Kenji Mizoguchi, and Akira Kurosawa. You may have heard of some of these. They all belong to a group that began directing films before World War II and continued afterward. Ozu and Mizoguchi into the late 1950s and Kurosawa all the way into the early 1990s. Now, it helps to know something about the history of Japanese filmmaking and cultural and intellectual forces that shaped the themes and styles of these masters before we turn to Teshigahara, who emerged out of that tradition and went a very different way. There was a well-established Japanese film industry beginning at the turn of the 20th century, but the influx of Western influences, particularly after World War II, changed it dramatically. Early pre-war silent Japanese films were versions of kabuki plays, that is to say, a traditional 16th century dramatic form of elaborately costumed, overwrought melodrama in which men played all the female roles in heavy makeup. Later, when Japanese films treated other subjects, many of the conventions of kabuki theater carried over into their plots and mise-en-scène well into the late 1930s. Now, another curious and distinctive feature of early silent Japanese cinema that has no equivalent in the West was the figure of what was called a benshi. This was a performer who would stand next to the screen and describe what was happening. He would speak the voices of the characters in these silent films in different intonations and interpret the action, a highly dramatic performance that sort of married film to theater. The benshi was so popular with the tradition-loving Japanese audiences that even after the dawn of sound film in the late 1930s, the Japanese studios continued to produce silent films and employ the benshi at cinemas where they were released. Now, despite such cultural differences from Western cinema, the Japanese studio system that produced films both before and then later after World War II was very much like Hollywood's in some ways. Their studios sought to give the public what it wanted in order to maximize profit. Directors were required to work under a monopolistic arrangement of a handful of powerful production companies that, like their American counterparts, used mass production model and a strict division of labor. But in Japan, this division of labor was part of a hierarchical structure not known in the United States, one based on a feudal model of master and apprentice. To become a director, then, Mizoguchi and Kurosawa had to work their way patiently up the ladder through a series of assistant directorships under the guidance of a mentor or master director. But by the time Teshigahara came to the scene in the 1960s, this hierarchical approach had loosened somewhat. Now, as in Hollywood, Japanese studios in the 1940s and 50s sought to produce movies as quickly as possible using a set of rules and templates. And the formulaic genres of Japanese production studios even surpassed Hollywood in their preoccupation with genre, because Japanese audiences delighted in classifying the type of film they were seeing. For example, a jideki geki was a type of Japanese historical film set during feudal times, and Mizoguchi and Kurosawa both directed masterpieces in that genre. But within that genre, there were subdivisions, including one called the Shambara. These were films that featured sword battles of a masterless samurai, that knight warrior class in feudal Japan. Well, Kurosawa's Yojimbo and Seven Samurai, that some of you may know, correspond to this particular subgenre, as does Mizoguchi's Kushinguara, though both directors take the Shambara in psychological and ethical directions that no one ever had before. Another broad genre within which some Japanese director worked was called shomengeki. These were social dramas where comic elements about contemporary middle-class life were always central. Japanese audiences then wanted the familiar, so Mizoguchi and Kurosawa's departures from those formulas were really risky given the studio system. And it is a measure of how much freer Teshigahara was in making Woman in the Dunes that film corresponds to no pre-established Japanese film genre at all. Another thing Teshigahara didn't have to contend with, that certainly Ozu and Mizoguchi in particular did during World War II, was censorship. All of the Japanese films during the war were reviewed by a Ministry of Propaganda, a board like the ones in Germany and Italy that censored productions to ensure that they presented only patriotic, highly nationalistic perspectives on Japanese history and society. The board soon co-opted the studios as part of the war effort, reducing them to just two and forcing them to become actively involved in the making of propaganda. Now, the best that Mizoguchi and Ozu could do under these circumstances was try to avoid making films that would offend the ministry while ignoring their most tendentious demands. Well, when U.S. forces occupied Japan in 1945, they imposed their own code of censorship. Japanese filmmakers were now not allowed to glorify the feudal past that had been used to summon nationalism during the war, nor were these directors now allowed to celebrate imperialism or militarism. This policy effectively put the genre of the samurai film on hold for several years. But the American presence also threatened to erode certain revered traditions in Japan. In Ozu's 1952 classic, Tokyo Story, for example, an elderly couple visiting their children and grandchildren in Tokyo begin to feel that they're a burden to this younger generation. They return home, sadly, and the woman dies. Well, traditionally, the Japanese revere their elders, but Tokyo Story reveals a breakdown of that ancient attitude of respect in the post-war years, a generational tension. And we'll see signs of this generational fracturing in Women in the Dunes as well, where the old ways of the village are enforced by aging men, while city life is dominated by an alienated younger generation. Now, of Teshigahara's three great predecessors, the one whose work most anticipates his own work, though again, he is very different from all of them, but the one that most anticipates it, I think, in two respects, is Mizoguchi. First, Mizoguchi incorporates dream sequences, especially in his masterwork Ugetsu, that reveal submerged desires and that unfold in a kind of strange hallucinatory setting. Second, Mizoguchi practiced what was called a long-shot aesthetic. That is, a technique of framing human figures against a larger natural landscape, a landscape that shapes their actions and marks the limits of their freedom. Teshigahara will use that, but Teshigahara will also use extreme close-ups more than any other director we're going to encounter. But that framing of characters against a landscape that was characteristic of Mizoguchi is something that Teshigahara does repeatedly in Woman in the Dunes, beginning with our first view of Junpei as he trudges across the dunes in search of insects. Let's have a look.
ひどいもんだなこいつ。
調査ですか。
調査？いや別に。何か調査が始まってるんですか？
いや、調査でなければ構わないんですがね。
昆虫採集ですよ、僕は。
なんだって？
虫を集めてるのさ。こういう砂地にいる虫を集めるのが僕の専門でね。
じゃあ本当に県庁の人じゃないんですね。
県庁とんでもない。僕は学校の教師ですよ。
先生してなさるんですかね。そうですか。
The credit sequence anticipates important themes and events to come. First, it introduces the theme of identity by representing names in 3 different registers. Japanese characters spell out the names of the actors, but the fingerprints and the imprints of ancient seals are 2 other marks of identification. The fingerprints suggest the modern world, where such fingerprints are used for legal and criminal identification, whereas the decorative seals, those circular seals, were a traditional way of distinguishing individuals for centuries in Japan. So from the start, Teshigahara then sets up a contemporary post-industrial world in contrast to the antiquated and isolated traditional realm into which the insect collector has now ventured. This juxtaposition is also present in the non-diegetic soundtrack. It begins with cacophonous urban sounds of traffic in the world of Tokyo that the protagonist is leaving, car horns, trains, public address systems. But these sounds are then replaced by the wooden clappers and tribal drums that summon ancient traditions and hint that Junpei is now entering an older, unfamiliar culture. His journey, then, is not just a journey through space, but also, in a sense, a journey backward through time. The first image is an extreme close-up of a grain of sand that we recognize as such only when Teshigahara systematically moves the camera upward, first to a simple close-up, and then a series of medium shots, and finally a long shot that reveals patterns of this all-enveloping element of sand. Sand is the defining element in which Junpei and the women will live. It is the multidimensional symbol of the entire film that holds it together brilliantly. Now, the sand has always been there, and to emphasize this, Teshigahara has his protagonist, a newcomer to the region, literally enter the first shot in which he appears of the sand from outside it, from the bottom of the frame. And then, in an extended tracking shot, the camera follows this newcomer, Junpei, as he trudges up a sand dune, never allowing us to see him in any context in this beginning other than against the omnipresent sand landscape that will soon imprison him and that within which he will eventually discover himself. In short, once Junpei enters the frame the first time, he seems caught within that shot as he is about to be caught within this strange world. Following his steps, we expect an editing cut, but the shot continues of him trudging through the sand in a long shot for nearly 2 minutes, unbroken. And this prolonged duration anticipates Junpei's temporal experience of being held in the woman's house long after he expects to leave, the next morning. We get a brief shot of the ocean that comes as a momentary relief from this omnipresent sand. The sea is the element that Junpei will long for hereafter, but will never reach once he is inside the woman's pit. Then we get a shot of a caterpillar, a close shot, trudging through the sand as the collector is. Junpei photographs the creature and then traps it in a glass collecting jar, a not very subtle image of his own captivity and entrapment to come. Teshigahara then gives us another extreme close-up, this time the head of a grasshopper-like insect that has somehow adapted to the merciless sands. Like the opening image of the sand particle, this enlargement seems to swallow us. The huge proboscis seems all-consuming, devouring, like the landscape itself. We feel engulfed in it, as he is engulfed in the landscape. A moment later, the traveler nearly stumbles into the steep pit of sand where far below we see the roof of the house that he is destined to inhabit. "This is terrible," he murmurs to himself, a phrase that he will repeat frequently. As he stands at the edge of the precipice, a shadow invades the frame and crosses his back. It's a local villager who is suspicious and has come. The villager wonders if Junpei has been sent by the local administrative district, the prefecture, on a mission perhaps to investigate the disappearance of men who have vanished in this area. When the collector tells him that he's just a school teacher, the villager's relieved expression and tone change. "I see," he says. Looking back, we now realize that he has at this moment marked Jumpy as a potential mate for the widow living in the nearby hole. The implication is that no one would really miss a teacher in the vast city. Jumpy's disappearance, the villager knows, will cause little concern. And at some level, Jumpy would like to disappear, even before he is imprisoned, and even though he will try to get away. There's a part of him that has wanted to escape the city. So as he lies contentedly in a sand-filled rowboat after collecting insects, we hear his thoughts in a voiceover that reflect that desire to get away. Have a look.
お互いを確かめ合うためのあらゆる種類の証明書、契約書、免許証、身分証明書、使用許可証、権利書、認可証、登録書、携帯許可証、組合員証、表彰状、手形、借用証、一時許可証、承諾書、収入証明書、保管書、さては決闘書に至るまで。果たして証明書はこれでしまいなんだろうか。まだ何か証明し忘れているのではあるまいか。男も女も相手がわざと手を抜いているのではないかと暗い猜疑の虜になる。潔白を示すために無理して新しい注文を思いつく。どこに最後の一枚があるのか誰にもわからない。証文は結局無限にあるらしいのだ。お前は俺が理屈っぽすぎると言って非難した。しかし理屈っぽいのは俺ではなくてこの事実なんだ。
先生、
いや、
これからどうなさるね。
どうするって明日また出直してくるつもりですがね。
でも上りのバスはもうしまいだが。
なるほど。しかしどっか泊まるところぐらいあるでしょう。
泊まるってこの部落にかね。
いや、ここじゃなくても国道の辺まで出れば。
歩いてですか。
別に急いでるわけでもないから。
そんなことまでせんでも先生さえよけりゃ口を聞くぐらいの世話してあげるで。ご覧の通りの貧乏村だが先生さえ構わなけりゃな。
そうですか。そいつありがたいな。ぜひお願いしたいな。その方が明日楽だし、それに僕はこういうところの民家なんかへ泊めてもらうのが大好きでね。
Jumpy hates the impersonality of urban life, especially the reduction of the individual self to nothing more than a collection of documents, ID cards, licenses, permits, receipts, certificates of ownership, and all of the other official registers of one's existence in Japan's bureaucratic post-industrial society. It demands all of those false versions of the self. They mean nothing. To be the sum of nothing more than this official paperwork, Jumpy realizes, is to be nothing at all. He feels this keenly. In reflecting on these artificial assignments of identity, he wipes away a pattern in the sand as if he would like to wipe away all the tedious documents that he has signed and that have been made to constitute who he is, quite falsely, he believes, in the eyes of the world. That gesture, of course, recalls Teshigahara's remark that sand, while it is an element in nature, also symbolizes modern society as a bleak, atomized collective. Society in Tokyo is composed of tiny, separate human particles, like the grains of this lifeless sand dunes. He would like Jumpy to wipe away that urban life. Now, we learn little about Jumpy's past life during the film, but here he does remember, the only time he does so, his estranged wife. She emerges as a kind of hallucination or dreamlike mirage in the sand dunes. And through this combination, Teshigahara once again symbolically links sand to the sterility of contemporary urban life and Jumpy's life in Tokyo. His wife, Jumpy remembers, used to criticize him for arguing and complaining too much. presumably about the depersonalized nature of modern life. Thus, we sense that Junpei's journey to the dunes isn't just for scientific research, though it is that ostensibly, but that it is also at some level a kind of protest against and escape from the urban life he hates. Now, this includes, this urban life, the mechanization of temporal experience, the urban clock. And in escaping the city, Junpei, although he wears a wristwatch, has forgotten about time so much that he has to be reminded that he has missed the last bus back to the city. When he says he's, quote, in no hurry, the old villager slyly suggests then that he stay somewhere in the village. Junpei says that he would, quote, love to see a real home, almost in a kind of ethnographic way, and he sees it as an alternative to his urban rootlessness, the idea of a real home. But that phrase, real home, also foreshadows what we'll see is Junpei's search for something real within himself. Now, on the way to the widow's house, Junpei is reminded of the natural dangers around him. The dunes conceal deep hidden pits and patches of quicksand. Also, in order to get to his dwelling, he learns that he must struggle down a primitive rope ladder as the sand blows into his mouth. As darkness descends, we hear only the groaning of the rope ladder and the sound of the distant sea. The dunes where Teshigahara filmed this movie actually do exist, of course, but the subterranean wooden house and the way of life in this village are Teshigahara's surrealistic inventions. And yet, paradoxically, this invented framework will uncover what is real in Junpei. Now, we enter the film's surreal dimension, this alternate reality, if you will, that will somehow provide Junpei with a stronger sense of truth and reality. We enter it the moment Junpei tumbles off that rope ladder and lands on his back. The widow quickly ushers him inside. Seeing her from the doorway, Junpei smiles, pleased to be having a genuine local experience. But also he smiles because the woman is surprisingly young and pretty. At first, the lack of electricity is something that he finds charming, even the absence of a bath to remove the sand that coats his body. But as he eats his meal of sea bream and rice, he's puzzled by the parasol that the woman fastens over the table to keep sand from falling into the food. Have a look.
いいえ、吹きたてのまっさらの屋根だって同じことですよ。
どうして？
本当に菊井虫よりもタッチの悪い。
菊井虫？
ええ。ほら、木に穴開ける。
ああ、シロアリのことか。
いいえ、これくらいの皮の硬い。
じゃあ、ノコギリカミキリかな？
ノコギリ。
うん、赤っぽいひげの長いやつでしょ？
いいえ、カラカの色した米粒みたいなやつですよ。
するとやっぱり菊井虫かな。
ほったらかしとくとこれくらいもある針だってブヨブヨに腐らしてしまうんですからね。
菊井虫なんかい？
いいえ、砂ですよ。
砂がどうして？
やっぱり湿気を呼ぶんでしょうかね。
In their conversation, Junpei asserts what he regards as his natural authority as a Japanese male, and as a city dweller, and as a man of science. But in this strange place, his cosmopolitan, masculine knowledge, and even his common sense, break down and fail. When the woman complains about an infestation of wood boars, Junpei draws on his entomological knowledge to challenge her. They can't be wood boars, but he's forced to concede that the bugs she describes can only be wood boars. He again corrects her condescendingly when she tells him that sand rots fish. This defies logic, he says, because sand, he says, is dry. Everyone knows that, he insists. But as in surrealistic films in general, this is a place where reason and normal laws don't hold. Junpei dismisses her claim that sand even rots shoes as ridiculous, but repeatedly he's forced to concede in the face of the woman's quiet insistence and her personal experience. But in other ways, the two characters here act out gender roles that had been long established under Japanese patriarchy and that hold both in the city and in this obscure village. The woman is happy to serve Junpei as a woman because he is a man and because he is her guest. But also, of course, she's happy to serve him because she needs him. She already refers cryptically to their, quote, first day. So as Junpei's captor, the woman is then a peculiar combination of subservience and power. When Junpei reveals self-doubts about his place in society, he exhibits while he reveals doubts about his place in society, he nonetheless exhibits an unmistakable sense of patriarchal privilege as a man in dealing with this woman. Indeed, the only thing that Junpei's tenuous sense of self can lay claim to is that he is a man, and an educated man. But when the woman goes out into the darkness, broom in hand, Junpei looks at his face in the mirror as if to confirm that his entire being hasn't begun to dissolve in this bizarre atmosphere. By the end of supper, his rustic adventure into a quaint culture has already begun to take a disquieting turn. The visitor learns that the sand surrounding them fosters wood lice and rots foods and invades houses and even turns water foul. This is terrible, he mutters again. Well, Teshigahara encapsulates these troubling and repellent conditions in the image of a dead fish head that we see in extreme close-up. Junpei soon learns that the sand holds other perils as well. The woman tells him that her husband and daughter were buried alive in an avalanche when they went out to the chicken coop during a storm. It's clear that Junpei is the husband's replacement when a villager bellows down into the pit and refers to Junpei as the woman's helper. A moment later, we see a close-up of a dead insect that Junpei is impaling with a pin in his collection. It's a fit image, of course, for Junpei's own situation. He doesn't know it yet, but he too has been collected. Well, shortly after, as Junpei holds a lantern, he watches in disbelief as the woman labors outside in the darkness, removing sand. And unknowing that he will in fact be her helper for the extended future, he offers now to help her, just to be polite. Have a look.
大変だね、あの連中も。
うちの部落じゃ愛嬌精神が行き届いてますから。
え、何精神だって？
兄弟愛する精神ですよ。
なるほど、そいつはいや。一体いつまでやるつもりなの？
朝まで。
朝まで？
だって砂は休んじゃくれませんからね。はいよ。
まるで部屋の死骸だ。
The woman will work through the night, only to perform the same excavation the following night, and all nights. It recalls the labor of Sisyphus in Greek myth, that figure who was condemned for eternity in Hades to push a boulder up a mountain only to have it roll back down again. Albert Camus regarded this as the paradigm of the absurd condition of human experience. But the woman doesn't see this as absurd. Even though the hellish environment killed her family, she has no desire to leave her birthplace, her house. Rather, as she shovels sand into boxes that are then hoisted from the pit on pulleys, she commends, quote, the real local spirit of the village. The place is so spectral and spooky that when she refers to spirits, Junpei thinks that the local spirit in question is a ghost. No, she explains that she means the community spirit that she so loves. Such a community-based identity is foreign to Junpei, so foreign that the mention of it strikes him as both bewildering and amusing. We see some of the distinguishing features of Teshigahara's visual style in this sequence. First, there's the extraordinary interplay of darkness and light that both in painting and in cinema is called chiaroscuro. That is a contrast of dark and light that intensifies the outlines of figures to create emotional effects. Here, the lantern's radiance in this dark pit converts the hole in the sand into a shadowy underworld that seems both fantastic and oppressive and frightening. That's what Junpei has begun to feel. Teshigahara's use here also of extreme high and low angle shots contributes to this feeling. But they also create a vertiginous effect, especially from Junpei's point of view, as he looks up at the pulley hauling boxes of sand and then down at the half-buried chicken coop. The camera's angles exaggerate the steepness and the depth of the pit where he is already a captive. And as he looks at them, he seems to somehow sense the impossibility of ever climbing out of this. But at this point, of course, the rope ladder is still there. Now, Junpei doesn't yet realize this, but the close-up of his watch face that he gazes at suggests his growing anxiety to leave. This individual who had lost track of time earlier and thus had been stranded now is aware of time. Yes, this is a little too strange for him. Well, like Buñuel, Teshigahara's dreamlike surrealism also incorporates the dreams of characters. Inside the house, we enter Junpei's dreams, suggested by the superimposition of his recumbent body over the image of rippling sand dunes. Just as the sand that had infiltrated his body from nose to mouth to toes was seeping into every part of his physical portion, so too we see in his dream that it has seeped this sand as an image into his unconscious life. The dream image also features the enlarged parasol, and that of course suggests Junpei's need for protection from this fearful element of sand that has invaded his dreams. But then he sees the form of the sleeping woman's naked body, and this erotic image first emerges in a kind of half-conscious state, as if Junpei is recalling her image in his sleep, the image of her that he saw before he went to sleep. But then he wakes up and he registers her naked body in profile in a fully conscious gaze. The camera presents the woman's silhouetted, recumbent form through Junpei's eyes in a succession of shots. Each one moves closer to her until we end with a prolonged close-up of her breast. Here, the chiaroscuro effect, the light and dark, is emphatically erotic because the contrast of light and darkness outlines her feminine curves as Junpei's eyes rove slowly over them. His sexual arousal is unmistakable because in the light of morning we find he's still watching the sleeping woman as he prepares, now a bit more reluctantly than the night before, to depart. His eyes explore every part of her body. Even as he dresses and leaves money for his night's lodging, he's watching her. Standing in the doorway, he casts the final look of what looks like regret, as if he is also somehow almost held in place by the force of his sexual attraction to her. Now, he doesn't discover that he's being held by other forces until he walks outside and notices that the rope ladder is missing. we immediately get an aerial shot of Junpei stranded and diminished in size, looking down on the pit from the cliff above. The shot emphasizes the impossibility of climbing out that Junpei had seemed to recognize the night before, but he proceeds to try to do so anyway. Have a look.
奥さん、ちょっと起きてくれませんか。悪いけどはしごを出してもらえないかな。はしごがなくなってるんだよ。そろそろ出かけたいんでね。たった3日の休暇をそう時間潰しもしてられないし。あれは縄ばしごだったな。縄ばしごだ。下からかけたり外したりはできないんだ。くそ、グルだったな。すみません。どういう意味だね。どういう意味かと聞いてるんだよ。
すみません。
すみませんだけじゃわからんな。僕は勤めてる身だからね。時間は大事に使いたいんだよ。
でももうお分かりなんでしょ。
お分かり？分かるわけはないじゃないか。
でも本当に女で一つじゃ無理なんですよ、ここの生活は。
そんなこと僕に何の関係ある。
もうじき北風の季節、砂嵐の心配もありますしね。
僕を虜にしようってのかい。
すみませんです。
The captives scramble up the sand cliff, only destabilizes it, causing a small avalanche that shakes the house. When he confronts the woman, she's lying with her face averted. She has been awake for some time, it seems, probably also aware of Junpei's prolonged gaze at her. She must now make the difficult disclosure that Junpei has failed to grasp despite her numerous hints. His captivity causes her shame. It's difficult to tell him what she must. And she can only repeat the words, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Sorry. Well, she's sorry that she and the villagers deceived him. She's sorry that he's been trapped against his will. But she's not sorry enough to try to release him. Perhaps she knows that her nakedness is an erotic lure, though she later explains that she always sleeps in the nude because sand trapped in clothing during slumber causes a rash. Well, despite the woman's apologies, she regards Junpei's captivity as a fait accompli, something ultimately beyond her control, absolutely cut and dried. Now, it was an arrangement really made for the woman by the community, but more important, for her, his presence is an existential necessity. There is simply no alternative. She explains that a woman in the dunes cannot survive on her own. She explains that her house will be buried under the sand without male assistance. Her husband is dead. She also regards holding Junpei as her civic duty, By clearing sand, helping her clear sand, together they're working for the good of the sand-imperiled village. In return, the village provides rations for the woman, who, with male help, will remove sand effectively and serve the utilitarian good of all. Sand shoveling, then, is a deeply rooted nightly ritual that binds this community together, one in which the woman is happy and proud to participate. She does not regard it as self-sacrifice. It's a way of life. Paradoxically, then, the same sand that operates as a symbol of the aridity of modern urban society also functions as a symbol of the bonds in this ancient culture that have been preserved by the place's isolation, the bond of sand removal that establishes their group identity and that holds them together. Now, Junpei will eventually come to understand this community ethos and even value it. But when he suddenly realizes at this point that he's been tricked, he threatens the woman by saying that he'll be missed back in the city, that people will be searching for him. But the woman knows better, because other men from the city, after all, have been captured in recent years, vanishing without a trace and apparently without much inquiry. The woman describes, for example, two other recent abductions, a postcard salesman and a student who was conducting a survey, who in fact is being kept 3 pits over, she says. When Junpei asks why the village doesn't plant trees to contain the shifting sand, she says they calculated that and decided it's much cheaper to trap men to shovel the sand in these pits. Now, local young men, the woman explains, seem to want to leave the village for the city, so it's therefore necessary to replace those young men who leave with men from the city. They're interchangeable, so it seems. There is a kind of grim Darwinian logic in this survival strategy that recalls the kinds of creatures that Junpei studies. Certain colonies of ants trap and consume their prey for the sustenance not only of themselves, but for the entire community. This is the Darwinian strategy of individual and collective survival that the village uses. Now, Teshigahara draws frequent analogies, clearly, between the insect world and the human world throughout this film. Junpei is a collector of insects who has collected himself, and like the tiger beetle he's seeking, he must then, in Darwin's sense, adapt to the peculiarities of this climate and landscape in order to survive. It's a struggle for him. Now, just as he gazes down to observe insects, so too the villagers, you'll recall, often peer down at him, watching from their panoptic vantage point above the house on the cliff edge. And as we get frighteningly enlarged images of the thorax and eyes of insects, so too Teshigahara's camera often presents extreme close-ups of the mouth and nose and neck of Junpei and the woman. Human beings, then, we're reminded, are simply part of the natural order, and like every other creature, human beings must struggle to survive, sometimes against one another, sometimes in collaboration with one another. Well, for Junpei, the struggle to survive initially can mean only one thing: escape. But his second attempt to scale the sand cliff, reveals the natural dangers he faces more explicitly than ever before. This time he tries to read the pattern in the sand cliff, and having done so, to dig holes to plant his feet. It produces a catastrophe, an even bigger sand avalanche, one that injures him. Have a look. Now, apart from its symbolic meanings, sand in this film, of course, is an irreducible reality, as Teshigahara insisted. And in exploring man's relationship to the natural world, Teshigahara makes it clear in this scene and elsewhere that nature is completely indifferent to human needs and aspirations. It operates, nature does, by immutable laws, including gravity. laws that human beings may be able to understand, but they're never going to be able to control. Well, as the sand slide overwhelms Junpei, note that he disappears from the bottom of the sand-filled frame just as he had first appeared in the film by walking into the frame from the bottom of a sand-filled image. We next see Junpei lying injured inside the house. As the woman obligingly washes him, he hatches a plot to win his freedom by force. Springing up, he overpowers the woman, ties her up, and gags her in an attempted reversal of his own captivity. That night, when the villagers lower the rope to haul up sandboxes, Junpei jumps aboard and threatens them. He won't untie the woman, he says, until they release him. Well, of course, they promptly drop him in the box and laugh at his impotence, looking down from the top of the cliff. But the village council then attempts to bribe Junpei to accept his condition and work by sending in a shipment of cigarettes and alcohol. Soon, however, when he fails to shovel the nightly sand, the villagers cut off supplies of food and water, as the woman had warned. Punished for his rebellion, Junpei realizes that the cigarettes and booze were intended to increase his thirst, as they do, in the event that they deprive him of water. It will be even worse, and indeed, they have deprived him of water. Now, during this period, the woman endures being bound and gagged without complaint. Only when her thirst becomes unbearable does she beg Junpei for water and apologize for doing so. Again, a peculiar kind of self-servience on the part of one who is complicit in scheming to entrap him. It's as if the woman regards being tied up as a necessary and unavoidable part of her female station, of her gender, just as she views trapping men as partners as a necessary and unavoidable feature of her community life, and just as she regards selling defective sand to city builders as yet another way she must survive. All of these things she must do as a woman in order to live. Ultimately, she doesn't feel any particular guilt about any of them. Some shame, perhaps, about trapping Junpei, but no real guilt, because she is fundamentally completely amoral. Now, the extreme close-ups of eyes and lips seem to swallow up the viewer, much as Junpei feels swallowed up in this pit. And this accumulation of extreme close-ups continues and accelerates at this point in the film. Junpei unties the woman only on condition, he says, that she'll join him in defying the village council by refusing to excavate sand. Quote, "If I suffer," he says, "you suffer." Well, Junpei's bravado is short-lived. Realizing how little power he has, Junpei suddenly says it's hopeless. He guzzles alcohol, which only increases his thirst, and begins battering the walls with a shovel in a rage of despair. The woman, seeing the danger here, throws herself on top of him as sand pours into the house through every crack. Junpei is terrified of being buried alive, and yet he covers the woman's body with his own body. The threat of death seems to have awakened Eros in him, but really in both of them, setting the stage for one of the strangest and most evocative sex scenes in cinema history. It's also one of the most inevitable. We've seen it coming from the moment he gazed at her naked body. When Junpei offers to brush sand off the woman's skin, sand removal now takes on new meanings and possibilities. She immediately understands his erotic intent and shows her interest by asking coyly if he doesn't prefer pretty city girls to a woman like her. Have a look. As Junpei wipes her body, the woman's hands fasten on his back, and we hear moans of pleasure blending with the ancient tribal drumbeat. The primal energy here is inseparable from the forbidding landscape that recalls the pagan lovemaking in the landscape in Andrei Rublev. That, we saw, was a rite of spring vegetation. Here, the arid sand that threatens and confines the couple also is essential in triggering their desire as an element in the landscape. Shortly before this, Junpei had told the woman, quote, "My fascination with sand is what brought me here." Now, that statement suggests that despite his attempts to escape, sand is Junpei's natural element. It's certainly the element in which he will eventually discover himself. The woman he desires is the embodiment of that elemental fascination with sand, and sand is going to bring Junpei to the truth about himself and the world. Few films, then, are as dominated by a single image as this one is by sand, but the meaning of sand as this central, pervasive, multi-layered symbol is as shape-shifting as the element of sand itself. At times in the film, sand in long shots resembles waves. At other times it resembles mountains. At other times it resembles waterfalls. Sand is a symbol, then, as diverse in its meanings as its images in the film. It is, for example, as I've already suggested, for Teshigahara, a symbol both of urban life and of nature. It's a symbol of existential futility and of communal support. It's a symbol of entrapment and of self-discovery. It's a symbol of Darwinian struggle and of sexual arousal. That's a lot to pack into a single symbol. Well, as the couple writhe in one another's arms in this scene, Teshigahara shows their entwined bodies in a series of extreme close-ups. Arms and legs, faces, loins, all covered with sand particles until the couple collapse onto the sand and consummate their desire. Now we get close-ups of the woman's face in orgasm as she clutches Junpei, suggesting that for her, this is not just a moment of sexual gratification, the first since her husband's death, but it is also for a moment of delirious predatory capture. She's holding on to him. She has him now, and she knows it. The cut to the cascading sand outside signals Junpei's orgasm in a not particularly subtle way, but remember, it also signals his captivity. This is what's keeping him there. But then, in a surprising image, Teshigahara complicates everything we've just seen. We see a bird in flight moving freely over the ocean. Now, this combination of final images, the image of the falling sand outside and the image of the soaring seagull, point to questions that Teshigahara is going to explore primarily in the second half of the film. First, can captivity, paradoxically, be a form of freedom? And second, can the erasure of one's established identity reveal a more genuine one? Okay. Well, after the scene of sexual passion, which Teshigahara sustains for 3.5 minutes, the camera pans slowly across the sand-strewn house to reveal Junpei and the woman lying in states of post-coital exhaustion. Junpei wakes up, realizes where he is, and is stricken with a desperate need for water. Now, the erotic implications of sand at this point give way, of course, to the symbol's Darwinian meaning. Every creature in nature must adapt or die when the environment changes. All creatures need water to live. Have a look.
畜生血が腐っちまうぞ。汚い死体を使いやがって。どうしたらいいんだよ。なんとかしてくれよ。血が腐っちまうよ。
だから私らが仕事にかかりさえすれば。
よし、負けた負けた負けてやる負けてやるぞ。
The crab scuttling across the floor to take shelter reminds us that Jumpy and the woman are also part of that same natural world, and they face two life threats at this moment. First, after not shoveling for several days, the sand has invaded the house and threatens to bury them. So much so, in fact, that the sand-dwelling crab has now taken residence in the sandy interior. And second, Jumpy's rebellious defiance has led to a suspension of the couple's drinking water. Like a desert traveler seeing the mirage of an oasis, Jumpy momentarily imagines that the sand blowing outside is rippling water. This superimposed hallucination quickly fades, and he desperately looks for a drop of water anywhere. He finds only damp sand at the bottom of the water jar. He wipes this sand across his face, thereby ironically covering himself more with the element that is threatening his life, and the element that he and the woman now need to begin excavating. Realizing his hopeless situation, he speaks bitterly of, quote, a dirty move. He's referring primarily to the village elders who tricked him into captivity and who are punishing him now for his attempted escape by inducing a terrible thirst. But the dirty trick he's alluding to may also refer to the woman whose sensuality prompted this sexual desire after he had untied her. Well, seeing his frustration, the woman smiles sweetly but triumphantly and says that we must now begin digging. That is, Jumpy must now begin adapting to the new environment that he had tried to defy and escape but cannot. And he must now begin to learn to live within it. He must, in short, the woman tells him, begin shoveling sand and then doing so because she says it takes getting used to. You will adapt to it. You will get used to it. Jumpy protests, I wonder if I will ever get used to it. But of course, he does. Now, Jumpy still regards removing the sand each night as an irrational exercise in existential futility at this point. His rational intelligence rebels against the absurdity of this way of life, but he needs to survive, and his will is broken. So, also, one might say, is Jumpy's belief in his own masculine dominance and his own superiority as a city-dwelling, educated male. Jumpy makes this concession to the woman when he says, you win. It's a concession he makes to her as a woman in despair and desperation. He uses, at this point, the leftover alcohol to light a fire at the end of a long pole and uses that to signal the village that he has conceded. We then cut to dream images of flowing water and an enlarged water droplet. But when the woman awakens Jumpy, a bucket of water has been lowered. Now the villagers smile down at the sand cliff. They've succeeded. Now, I'll finish my discussion of Woman of the Dunes in the first half of my next lecture and then devote the second half of it to the Ingmar Bergman incomparable film Cries and Whispers, at least the early parts of that film.